Thank you, Patricia, and welcome to the club's last meeting of 2015. Our featured speaker is Chris Goldfinger, professor of geology and geophysics at Oregon State's College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. In addition, he is director of the Active Tectonics and Seafloor Mapping Laboratory at Oregon State. Chris and his work was heavily featured on the July 20th New Yorker article titled "The Really Big One," and is acknowledged to be one of the world's leading experts on what is known as the Cascadia subduction zone. The author's preface to the article reads, "The next full margin rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone will spell the worst natural disaster in the history of the continent." Chris will tell us why that is, and I'm hoping that if we ask him very politely, he will tell us exactly when it will occur. Chris will be followed by Rob Johnson, a former 40th District legislator, former director of the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, and since 1996, a FEMA Disaster Recovery Reservist. Rob will help us understand how our community should respond to and prepare for such a disaster. Our format today consists of a half hour or so of comments by Dr. Goldfinger, followed by 10 minutes or so by comments by Mr. Johnson. Then a few questions by me prepared by our program committee, and then questions by our badge-wearing members. So now, that said, please welcome to the City Club, direct from Corvallis, Oregon, Dr. Chris Goldfinger.
Well, that sounds pretty scary. I'm not sure I want to stick around for this. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Chuck and the program committee for inviting me up and treating me very, very well indeed. It's always hard to really get into doom and gloom, but if you're an earthquake geologist, it's not that hard. It's actually kind of... So I'm the only one who actually has fun with this stuff. But anyway, I'm going to run through some of the information that led to discovery of Cascadia as a subduction zone, a fault, and then a hazard came later, and then we'll talk and maybe have some time for questions about what do we all do about it after we get through with the doom and gloom part. So I know this is going to be a little hard to see, but we'll give this a try. So we do have slides. So if anybody watches The Big Bang Theory, you often see Sheldon kind of ragging on geologists as being not a real science, which is why I got into it. All the geologists were loading up pickup trucks and station wagons to go to Death Valley, and they looked like they were having a lot more fun, and so I went with them. But it's kind of interesting that geology really is pretty far behind all the other sciences. And if you think about it, when Apollo 11, when Neil and Buzz were bouncing around having fun on the moon, at that time in July 1969, think about that, plate tectonics was only 6 years old. So we could fly to the moon. We knew what general relativity was. We knew about the curvature of space-time and all of those things. And we didn't know where mountains came from in 1963. And the explanations of the time were sort of like, scientifically, were something like the stork brought it. I mean, they were really bad. And so Sheldon is actually kind of right. We are the Kardashians of science. And here's a Buzz, actually, because Neil had the camera, setting up a seismometer on the moon. And we were actually recording moonquakes, which we created when we crashed the lunar module into the moon when we were done with it. But we didn't know where earthquakes on Earth came from. That was the funny thing. And so, so back on Earth in Cascadia, this is what Cascadia looks like, if you can see that. We're way up there in the upper right corner where the logo is, right on top of Bellingham, I think. But anyway, that's what Cascadia looks like. And if you drained out the water, and so here's North America, here's the plate boundary is this line between the light blue and the dark blue. And this dark blue is the continental, the Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates subducting northeast about this direction at about 40 millimeters a year, which is about how fast your fingernails grow. Seems pretty slow, seems fairly benign and harmless. And so Cascadia was an interesting case because in 1961 through 4, when plate tectonics just revolutionized understanding of Earth science, we suddenly understood that the Earth was made up of big plates moving around, that they banged into each other, that they dove under each other and sometimes crumpled up into mountains. All of these things put all of the big picture features of geology into focus, like almost overnight, just in a couple of years. And then Cascadia became an instant enigma because Cascadia had one thing, or was lacking one thing that all other subduction zones have. And a subduction zone is just where one plate dives underneath another. And it was lacking one thing that they all have. Does anybody know what that is? Earthquakes. It has no earthquakes. All other subduction zones have earthquakes almost daily. If you go to Japan, people at lunch will just be eating lunch, and they'll have a magnitude 4 or 5 earthquake, and then maybe look up, and that's about it. It's nothing. It's every day. It's constant. And Cascadia is just dead silent, and there are only about 5 or 6 earthquakes that are even actually big enough to have been written up in any way in historic times. So Cascadia became this immediate enigma, and it still is. Still to this day, nobody knows why Cascadia is so quiet. But in 1984, a Canadian geologist named John Adams first found some evidence that maybe over the long term, maybe it's not as quiet as it seems from day to day. And then Brian Atwater in 1987, a few years later, found some more direct evidence, and his is a little easier to see because you can summarize it in a photo. And what he found was if you dig out the bank along Willapa Bay or almost any bay along the Cascadia coast where there's a marshland, you see something like this. You see marsh surface, you see some mud below it, then you see some sand, and then you see an old marsh, which is all turned into peat here, so it's black. And so here you had a marsh here, some sand on top, some mud, and then a new marsh. And what this says is that basically either the land level changed or the sea level changed sometime between here and here because these things grow at the top of the tide. And so Brian argued that it was the land level that changed relative to the ocean rather than the more obvious thing that you might think. And not only did it do that, but it did it really quickly. Land level changed fast because the grasses, the marsh grasses that were in this peat were entombed essentially alive by sand, this sand sheet on top, which came from a tsunami. And so at first, nobody believed any of this stuff. And Brian diligently took people on field trips out there again and again and again. And he said, well, if you don't believe my idea, what's your idea? And we all looked at each other and went, okay, we'll get back to you on that. None of us ever came up with a better idea. So this was the last man standing, and it turned out that Brian was correct. And also John Adams was correct. So Cascadia, it turns out, is not quiet over the long term. There's direct evidence of great earthquakes. And sort of the final piece of the puzzle came into focus in about 1996 when a Japanese colleague, Kenji Satake, found evidence of what's become known as an orphan tsunami. And that the tsunami arrived in Japan in the year 1700, and it arrived without an earthquake. So the Japanese were well versed in the concept of earthquake and then 20 minutes later tsunami. And they always come in pairs, but this one came without an earthquake and surprised people, so they didn't have time to evacuate or anything. And some people were killed, and warehouses were damaged, and some boats were lost. And so Kenji modeled the tsunami and tried out various subduction zones around the Pacific to see what would be a good fit, and he found out really that Cascadia was the only possible fit. So so now we have land evidence of earthquakes, and we have tsunami evidence arriving in Japan. And the people working on, Brian Atwater and David Yamaguchi and a number of others had worked on this, and they'd gotten the age of this event down to about somewhere between 1699 and 1702. Pretty tight by counting tree rings and so forth, trees that were killed by this. And the Japanese tsunami arrived January 26, 1700 AD, and was launched about 9 o'clock the night before. And so these separate bits of evidence came together really well to form a nice story. And so we actually know down to the hour when the last earthquake was, at a time when only the Native Americans were here to actually experience it. So maybe geologists aren't doing too bad. We're starting to catch up a little bit. And so here's Brian in his preferred environment in the muck in Willapa Bay. And at the head of the bay, you can see this all around the Pacific Northwest, you see these snagged trees growing out of the marsh. And I think almost everybody has seen this and not given it too much thought. But a lot of times these trees were killed in the last earthquake, and they're actually not young snags, but they're 300 years old. And they're western red cedars, which don't rot very well. That's why we use them for decks. And so they're still there, a lot of them. And so here's how it works. On the bit on the left, when the two plates are locked together, the weaker plate, which is North America, does the buckling as the plates come together. And so it bulges upward, and then when it lets go, the coast subsides. And then the outer part of the leading edge of North America bulges up, and the combination of those generate a tsunami. But in the small scale, you see here a marsh and a tree, and then all of a sudden, the whole thing drops about a meter or so. So what was the edge of the bay is now in the bay. And about 20 minutes later, the tsunami comes in, lays down a sand sheet. A week later, the tree has already died from saltwater intrusion. And then a few hundred years later, the whole system is hiked all back up again out of the water in the next earthquake cycle. And then this repeats over and over and over again over time. And so a lot of different things happen during the earthquake. We have what you just saw there, but also we have landslides in the coast ranges and the Cascades. And we have landslides offshore here. And this is just a cross-section through the Oregon part of the margin showing the Juan de Fuca Plate diving underneath North America. And this sort of lumpy blue area belongs to North America, but it's just recently accreted sediment. So North America is sort of acting like a snow shovel, and all the sediment that came out of the Cascades during the glaciation and the Pleistocene wound up on the Juan de Fuca Plate, and then it gets basically shoveled straight back onto North America, making this sort of a rumpled area out here called the accretionary wedge. And so landslides offshore generate something called turbidity currents, and I guess I'm not going to be able to. They make turbidity currents, which are just submarine landslides, kind of a slurry of sand and mud running down the canyon systems into deep water. So anyway, you too in your fish tank can simulate. The fish might not like it, but you can simulate a turbidity current just with some mud and dirt. And so this kind of chaotic mess just runs out into deep water, and it leaves a sand layer that records what happens. And then if you can click on that one as well. So this is kind of cheesy little animation that I made. It's not very Hollywood. But anyway, you see a bunch of these coalescing and running down the major submarine canyons like that. And then if we zoom out and see all of Cascadia like that, if you can click on that one, it'll show some of the major pathways for these submarine landslides spreading out onto the Juan de Fuca Plate. So the idea is that in a great earthquake like this, all of these things would let go synchronously all over the margin, and that's one of the tools that we use. And so here are the layers here, looking like that. We use a gigantic lawn dart, about a 6,000-pound lawn dart on a big ship to collect these things. And the trick is, though, that you can't really tell that these deposits are from earthquakes just by looking at them. You have to use some other tool to get at that. And so here's what the margin looks like, and you can see some of the little dots here are core sites out there. And so I mentioned one of the tools that you use to test this record for whether it's generated by earthquakes or just some random landslides or storms or something else is to see whether they're synchronous or not. Well, synchronous that's hard to do. Radiocarbon only gets you to within 100 years or so, and that's not exactly a good test. And so what would you do? Well, I would say cheat. And this is what John Adams did, and he realized, he's quite a smart guy, and what he realized is we don't care exactly what time it was, what time of day or what year or what calendar date it was. All we have to know is whether they happened at the same time or a different time. It doesn't really matter what time that was exactly. And so what he did was come up with this clever little test, and it's a little hard to see there, but there's an ash deposit out there called the Mazama ash that came from Crater Lake blowing up in 7,600 years ago. And it left ash all over the Pacific Northwest, and many of you probably know about this and have heard of it. And so it turns out that if you go offshore and take cores in all these canyon systems, almost every one of them has the Mazama ash in it. And it has 13 turbidites, 13 of these layers above the ash. So Adams thought, well, wait a minute, why would you have 13 of them down here and up here off Washington? Why such a coincidence? And so that was his first test, the coincidence test. There's really no reason to expect similar numbers over such a big area. But then he had a bigger test of that, and he used the Willapa submarine canyon, which is down here, and the Juan de Fuca canyons, which come together at a confluence. And what he found was that on one arm of the confluence, you had 13 post-Mazama turbidites, and on the other arm, you also had 13. When it comes together and you go downstream, you still have 13. So if they happened at different times with, exceeding maybe an hour or two, you should have 26 or some other number, not 13, but you have 13. So it means that 13 times in a row in 7,600 years, turbidity currents came to that confluence and got there within an hour of each other, starting out 150 kilometers apart. So right there, John Adams, who never took a core, never left his desk, never went to sea, and used core logs that we faxed him from OSU. My advisor did, anyway. He figured out that 13 times in a row we had great earthquakes that shook the entire Pacific Northwest without ever leaving his chair, which was pretty darn smart. I give John Adams a lot of credit for that. So we're not nearly as smart as John, so we did it the dumb way. We got a ship and spent a lot of money and spent months out at sea and collected a lot more cores. And so I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly to keep us on track and not get too bogged down in the details. But what we use basically is oil field techniques. It's called well logging. And we collect cores and we use geophysical properties, which are these wiggles that you see. Whoops. Uh-oh, got too many things going here. These wiggles on the side of the core, they represent density, grain size, magnetic susceptibility, and other properties of the core. But what they are basically is fingerprints of these deposits. And we use oil field well logging techniques to try to correlate them from place to place. So we can use radiocarbon, but again, it's plus or minus 100 years. So we're looking at ways to see if we can link them together in not quite as elegant way as John Adams did. And we use CT scans and various high-tech toys like that to look pretty closely into these deposits. And so just as an example, here are four density wiggles. So these blue wiggles are just the density of the deposit, which is sort of a proxy for grain size, just the particle size of the grains. And you can see that they look kind of similar. They look sort of like a molar tooth with two little spikes. And so even though these are different, you can see that they have some broad similarities. And so looking at this in context, I know this is hard to see, but the one on the left came from Juan de Fuca Canyon, which is about our latitude here. The one on the south came from southern Oregon at the Rogue Canyon. So we can actually link things that far apart simply by fingerprinting the deposits themselves and matching the wiggles just much as the same way as you use fingerprints. And so that's become a really effective technique for testing for, it's not really testing for synchronicity time-wise, but it's testing to see if they're the same deposit or if they're related in some way. And this is even harder to see. But this is just some examples of doing that for various panels. And in each case, the two pairs of cores you see in the three panels, These cores come from canyon systems that have no physical connection. They're completely isolated from each other, and yet they contain almost identical records that you can match the individual deposits event for event without any physical connection. So there's another whole story in itself behind that. But anyway, off Washington, here's just an example of the modern version of John Adams' confluence test, where we have a lot more cores than he had to work with. There they are. And we have the northern part of the confluence in blue. We have the southern part of the confluence in yellow. And I can't quite read the numbers, but big distances between these things. And here's what all the cores look like. And sorry, there's no way to go through this and interpret it. But basically, there's a drainage divide, that little red line I just put up. All of these cores are on the northern part. These cores are on the southern part. And it turns out you can correlate right across the drainage divide as if it wasn't there. So what it's saying is that these beds are being generated on one side of the divide and on the other side of the divide, and they're indistinguishable from each other. And we also, in the modern view, we also confirmed John Adams' hypothesis about the Mazama ash. We found slightly different numbers, but almost identical across the margin here. And then we found also a key heavy mineral glaucophane, which comes from only the northern part, is not found in the southern part. But when you go down to the confluence and mix the yellow and the blue drainages there, you find glaucophane, this little mineral, mixed together in the deposits as they actually mixed in real time. So basically, we've kind of thrown as many pies at John Adams' hypothesis as we could, and we couldn't defeat it. So it's worked out really well. And so we've also been doing, I'm going to just skip this one, some hydrodynamic modeling to get a little more sophisticated about where these currents actually go in real time. And so there's one of the ships we use. This is the University of Washington's Thomas G. Thompson. This is kind of the typical sort of vessel you need to do this work. It's 270 feet long, has about 55 people on it when you're doing a full kind of factory ship operation. It took about a month to do our initial Cascadia work and a couple of shorter cruises later on. But it turns out that you can also do this. So this is a few of us on two Grumman canoes with a piece of plywood on top. And this is Lake Sawyer, which is about 50 k's south of Seattle in the town of Black Diamond, if you know where that is. And it turns out that when the ground shakes, you get turbidity currents in lakes as well. And almost all the lakes in this region are Pleistocene age, at least. So we've got 10,000 years of sediment. And guess what? It's full of earthquake deposits, it turns out. So this is a little easier and cheaper. And so we've been working on lakes lately, which is kind of cool. And so here's just a zoom in of the bottom part of this lake. This happens to be one of our offshore cores on the right, and this little wiggle that you, I'm sure, can't see very well on the left is from Triangle Lake, just west of Eugene. And if you can see it, you can see that this wiggle and these wiggles are virtually identical. So we're generating earthquake records in inland lakes that match the offshore really well, using the fingerprint method and radiocarbon. The radiocarbon dates are also indistinguishable. So the good thing about this is that all of the paleoseismic evidence I showed you from John Adams and Brian Atwater and our work, all of that stuff is far offshore. But guess where all the people live? We're pretty far from the fault. We're way back here, you know, at the foot of the Cascades or in the Puget-Willamette lowland. And so having evidence, you know, this far inland can help us get at how hard the ground shook, you know, this far inland without using a long train of logic to sort of model that or deduce that from something else. So this is going to be a pretty handy thing. And so here's some of the lakes we've been working in. Sawyer Lake is here, Leland Lake, Tarboo Lake, Beaver Lake, and right on a nice transect through Seattle with some of our offshore cores that are out there in red. And so we're seeing, and this impossible to see also figure, is another attempt to wiggle match the offshore cores with the onshore. And the records we're finding so far, this is not published yet, so just a little caveat there. But so far, it looks like the wiggle matching is producing very, very, very similar records in these lakes. And although we thought we would see local faulting and volcanic ashes and all sorts of things in the lakes, we're really not seeing a lot of that. We're seeing mostly a Cascadia record, it looks like. We might see the Seattle Fault, which went off in about 1,100 years ago. But other than that, we're seeing pretty much the same record we see offshore, which is the subduction zone. And then, just this year, Canadian colleagues at the Geological Survey of Canada, working just a little north of here at a place called the Slipstream Slump, used basically the same methods that we've been using and found exactly the same record that we've been finding. So it's always comforting a little bit when you find somebody else who can reproduce your results. That's sort of a fundamental thing about science. And until somebody else does that, people always kind of wonder, is it just those guys, or could anybody go out and do this? And it's so it turns out this group, they at first thought we were crazy doing this wiggle matching business. And then they went out and tried it for themselves, and it turned out it worked. So they just published this and got some very nice results from just off Vancouver Island. Okay, so a little bit of good news is that one of the things about subduction zone earthquakes around the world is that in a lot of places of the world, people have really no idea what the hazard is. They may have one historical earthquake, they have no idea how often they happen or any of that. And so the good news is that although this is a big deal, and Catherine Schultz's article is probably accurate in the sense that if we have one of these anytime soon, it probably will be the biggest disaster in North America. But on the other hand, we know more about the subduction zone now than any subduction zone in the world. So a dozen or so of people have been working on this for almost 30 years now. So there's very little doubt about what the hazard is and what the risk is. Now it's sort of the ball's back in our court to do something, but at least we're not going to be surprised, probably. Yeah, probably. So I'd like to just reduce all of that data into something a little more fun to look at. And so this is Cascadia, the movie. There is a movie. It's really short. But it's going to show the 10,000-year earthquake history of Cascadia compressed into about a minute, or maybe two. So would you mind? Or actually, it might just go by itself. Let's just see. There we go. It's going good. So what you're seeing then is the red flashes are basically the length and width of the earthquake. The length is known from the paleoseismology. The width is estimated from other things. And it's playing at about 200 years a second. And so these big ones, like that one, the full-length ones are probably magnitude 9-ish, high 8s to low 9s. And in between every pair of big ones, you'll see that there are some small ones in there. They're usually down here. There's a really big one. So this is, I think, the only fault in the world that has a movie like this. So after that big one, there were 5 little ones down south, and a 1,000-year gap for you lucky folks up here in the north.
Are we seeing Washington and Oregon? Is that what's on?
Yeah, sorry. It's Strait of Juan de Fuca's right about here, and Northern California's about there. I know it's hard to see. So about 3,000 years ago, the land paleoseismic record kicks in, the Brian Atwater stuff. Our record is 10,000 years long. And you can see there's a little yellow flash down here. That's actually the San Andreas Fault, where there's also a 10,000-year record. And you may notice that it goes off at about the same time as Cascadia, which may not be coincidence. About 3/4 of the time, the San Andreas earthquakes are indistinguishable with radiocarbon from Cascadia. So either one fault is triggering the other, or it's just a huge coincidence. And we don't really know which at this point. And then, so here we are at AD 1700, the last great Cascadia earthquake, and of historical records in Japan, and also Native American legends. So you may have heard there was a great battle between Thunderbird and Whale, two Native American gods, and this great battle involved a lot of shaking of the ground and a lot of washing away of villages and things like that, and it happened at night in the middle of winter. So it sounds a lot like the 1700 earthquake, and most people have concluded that that earthquake generated the legend of this great battle. And so if you summarize that movie, here's what you see. There's 43 earthquakes total, and broken into, now we started out with 4, now we've got 7 basic scenarios. So we've got about 20 full-length ruptures that are magnitude 9-ish, 8.8 to 9.1. We've got a few of these, a half dozen of those ending at the Columbia River. 2 of these ending about Central Oregon, about 10 of these limited to northernmost California, and some very small ones down south, and a single sole example that seems to be limited to just the Washington coast. And so, this is how we hope the earthquake is going to be. It's going to ruin the Etch-a-Sketch display at the gallery. And it could be like that. But so I want to talk a little bit about probabilities. So we have more than enough data now to calculate the probabilities, not from a model that depends on any sort of recurrence model of earthquakes. We actually have the data. And it would be like going down to the repair department of a disk drive company and saying, well, Bob, how many failures have come in this month? So, well, we've got 70 of them. So you know exactly how many times this Cascadia as a part has failed. And so we can plot it pretty easily on the same kind of plot that they do. And so all companies do this because they know they want to make the warranty a little bit shorter than when your toaster breaks and they want it to break the day after. So it's a well-known calculation. So anyway, if you look at the northern margin where we are, there's actually a little bit of good news. So we'll try to make the turn into some better news here. And so this plot is just unreliability, it's called, on the left. It just means chance of an earthquake, 100% up here, 0 down here, and time across the bottom in a log scale. And so if we put a dot on this map 50 years from now and say, what's the probability in the next 50 years, that would be this dot right here. And these little blue dots are all the recurrence times between pairs of earthquakes for the last 10,000 years on the northern part of the margin. So this is Columbia River northward, roughly. And so blue dots on the right are in the future. They're beyond 50 years. And dots on the left are things that we've exceeded. So you can see that we haven't even made it. The average repeat time is around 400 to 500 years, and we haven't even made it to the average repeat time yet. So that means that probabilities in the northern part of Cascadia are modest. I wouldn't say low, but they're modest. They're about 10 to 15% in the next 50 years. Probability-wise, that's actually fairly high. It doesn't sound impressive, but anyway, the good news is if you live at the northern end of the Cascadia margin, you're in the better place. At the south end, on the other hand, it looks a little different. So 50 years from now, we will have gone past, well, today, we've gone past 75% of all the known intervals, which average 240 years. Remember, it's been 315 since the last one. So we've gone past 75% of them. In 50 years, we'll have gone past 85% of them. So imagine you're sitting on a branch sawing through it, and you've sawn through 85% of the branch, and it's creaking, and you're going, I wonder when we're going to have a failure here. And so there are only 6 left that are longer than 360 years. And so the chances of these folks having an earthquake in the next 50 years are almost 40%. I mean, it's really high. So this would be about from Newport, Oregon, southward, roughly. And so in the Pacific Northwest, the good news is that we think collectively the science of subduction zone earthquakes, we think we have it down fairly well. We don't think we're going to get surprised by something that's unexpected, never seen, never expected. And that's different than Japan. Japan had a highly industrialized coast with nuclear power plants and major cities, and they really didn't have a clue about the geology for the most part. And so they were very surprised to get a 9 earthquake when they had expected an 8.4, and all of their coastal defenses and the nuclear power plants and all that were predicated on an 8.4, and they would have done fine with an 8.4, but they got a 9. So we don't think that's going to happen here. The bad news is that Japan had a 1,000-year head start on us in terms of building up their infrastructure to manage earthquakes, to manage the risk to people. We have just found out about this in the last couple of decades, and so we've built all of our cities on top of what we thought was just a perfectly quiet place, and now it turns out we're sitting on a ticking time bomb, more or less. And so we have a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings like this. This building was destroyed by a 4.2 fracking earthquake in Oklahoma, so it doesn't take much with this kind of fragile infrastructure to do a lot of damage. And this is a little Oregon-centric, but in Oregon alone, we have 300 bridges that are collapse hazards. We have a lot of drawbridges that have big counterweights that do terribly in earthquakes. And a lot of very tall, spindly bridges that just have no resistance to earthquakes at all. And that's true here as well. We have 1,000 schools, unreinforced masonry schools. And kids are the only people that don't get a choice about where to go to work in the morning. They go where we tell them to go, and we tell them that it's safe to go there. And it turns out that's not really the case. So in Oregon, we have 1,000 of unreinforced masonry schools. In the Pacific Northwest, overall, I think there are about 3,000 total, something like that. And they're being retrofit at an incredibly slow rate. It's going to take 1,000 years at the current rate, to do all of these. And so I'm going to talk a little bit. I've got probably going to go over a little bit. Okay, no problem. So I want to talk a little bit about Japan. So here's the doom and gloom part about Japan. It wouldn't have made that much difference, really, had they known a 9 was coming. It would have looked about the same. And so this is what typical coastal cities and ports look like, the day after or the day of the earthquake. But you have to put this in perspective. You have to think about basically the same size earthquake that Sumatra had in 2004. So around the Indian Ocean, 230,000 people died in the 2004 earthquake because very few people even knew what a tsunami was, let alone what to do about it. In Japan is very well hardened against earthquakes and very well educated. They drill in the schools and everywhere about earthquakes. And so the difference between Sumatra and Japan is Japan lost roughly 20,000 people. So an order of magnitude, more people were saved by good infrastructure and good education, essentially. And so as crazy as this looks, this is what success looks like. We destroyed a lot, the earthquake and the tsunami destroyed a lot of property and ships and fish plants and oil tanks and things like that. But those can all be replaced, and the loss of life was relatively light for one of these types of events. And so one little story. This is Mayor Sato of a town called Minami Sanriku. And we met Mayor Sato a year ago, and this was his office in Minami Sanriku, and the entire town was behind here. Now it's a meadow, and the only thing left is this, which happened to be a steel frame building. And so Mayor Sato told us an interesting story. He said he was a little boy in 1960 when the biggest recorded earthquake on Earth went off in Chile, and it launched a tsunami toward Japan, and it was about 2 meters tall when it arrived there. Actually, he said it was even smaller than that. So they had an evacuation of the town. Everybody went up on the hill and saw this silly small wave come into the bay, and it was all a lot of fun. So fast forward now to 2011, and he's now the mayor of the town that he grew up in. And the scientists had told him that the earthquake would be about an 8.4, and the tsunami would be about 2 to 3 meters or so. Well, they got a 15-meter tsunami, and they destroyed the town completely except for the steel frame of this building, which was the public safety building. 46 people died in this building because they stayed at their stations broadcasting the warnings, and 8 people survived hanging onto the cell phone tower. And so here's Mayor Sato's selfie hanging onto the cell tower, and that's the roof of that building, and the entire town was just a bay. So what Mayor Sato told us, he said, I don't really listen to scientists much anymore. And so when we drove into Minami-Sanriku, we saw they were strip mining the hillsides and helicopter logging the hillsides too, and we were wondering what they were up to. And it turned out what Mayor Sato is going to do now is he's going to raise the base level of the town 4 meters, just make it taller, and that's where the dirt was coming from. And then he's going to put the town back on top. And so that's sort of the Japanese solution to the problem. They're just not going to screw around with this anymore. And so that's how Minami-Sanriku is going to rise from the ashes. And so in the Northwest, all of us are struggling with this same kind of thing. And in Oregon, there's in Gold Beach, the folks there decided to build a hospital in a tsunami zone. And they used sort of a loophole to get around the rules on that. And so they decided, to do something like that. In Washington, you probably all know about the Acosta School that they're building up to be an evacuation center out on the Long Beach Peninsula. And so people are trying to figure out how they're going to deal locally with these issues. Vertical evacuation structure, just bury your head in the sand, or do something else. And so people are making different choices. And unlike Japan, we don't have a top-down culture where the government just decrees that it'll be so. All the communities are sort of left, in a way, to decide this for themselves. And so, and in Newport, Oregon, this is kind of fun. My own university is building a new 500 seat occupancy school building on a sandbar in the middle of the tsunami zone, which all of the geology department people are not really crazy about. And so, so I don't know. These are difficult choices, and so. Any good news out there? Yeah, if anybody saw this movie, the good news is we're not going to have a 400-meter high tsunami that's going to take out the Golden Gate Bridge and anything like that. But I wanted to close with this, and if I could get some help to click on that upper link there, that would be great. So it turned out that on March 11th, 2011, I was in Japan. We were at an earthquake meeting. And then it's going to just say allow on there or whatever, or enable or something like that. And it'll play. So there were 40 of us at an earthquake meeting, and we were, can you scoot that screen? There we go. And so there we are. We're changing speakers. It's about 2:45 on Friday afternoon. And the earthquake has already happened, and the P waves are heading for us as we change laptops. And the meeting is kind of winding down. We're all tired, but we were there for a meeting. These are Indonesian colleagues, these guys, and we were all there for a meeting about the 2004 Sumatra earthquake. And right about now, the P waves just arrived, and we're all looking around. And we don't have sound rigged up, but everybody was laughing. And you'll see this guy's looking at his watch. So we're all laughing, going, oh, how funny is that, have an earthquake during an earthquake meeting? And it was pretty funny. At first, anyway. But I wanted to show you this because it's hard to get a sense of what a magnitude 9 earthquake is like, just from words or graphs or whatever, but this is what our earthquake was like. And so we're actually in the middle of it right now, and we're still laughing. And so this little Panasonic camera had a stabilizer in it, and it removed the earthquake pretty handily. But Kenji Hirata, this guy, realized that, and he had the presence of mind to come over and point the camera at the windows, where you can see the window shades are kind of banging against the windows at this point. And so we're all kind of wondering what to do. And this is the part the emergency managers hate, because we all decided to bail and go outside. I looked at the little plastic desk on wheels and decided I wasn't going to get under there. And And I think we all simultaneously made sort of the same decision. We went outside. This is on the second floor of a building that was brand new. We kind of all knew that this building was new. We were in Japan, and this building was bulletproof. So there was nothing that was going to actually happen to us. But there we are, you know, we're supposedly earthquake experts, and we're all just going, what are we supposed to do? So we go outside. No, not that way, the other way. There we go, okay. But as you see this go by, you'll see that the building has got these 1 meter square columns every few meters. And so the building was just rock solid. It was a block house, although it did have these great big windows. And, but the main point of this is to give you an example of what a magnitude 9 earthquake actually looks like when you're in one. And the point of that is that many of you may have been in earthquakes like Northridge or Loma Prieta or California-type crustal earthquakes, and they're quite different. My mom was in Loma Prieta, and she said she was thrown like 10 feet from the kitchen into the living room and doesn't remember getting there. It was just like I was washing the dishes one second, I was in the living room the next second. But subduction zone earthquakes are not like that. And so the good news is that these types of earthquakes, they tend to be long, rolling kind of earthquakes. People feel seasick. They don't toss you into the next room. They don't do all their damage instantly. They're long. This earthquake took 5 minutes to play out. And so you're watching the entire earthquake in real time. It's going for about 2 or 3 minutes already. And so here we are just walking outside. I mean, what you can't see in this is it was really impressive. I mean, you can feel the Earth's plates just grinding and crunching underneath your feet. You can feel the ground rolling. You can see the trees. They still had some fall leaves on them, and they were dry, and they were rattling, making this creepy sort of rattle. And you could look up behind where we don't see in the film and see the flagpole on top of this building just whipping back and forth. One of these stout, tapered aluminum flagpoles just back and forth. And so, but anyway, you can see that nobody gets hurt in the earthquake, and partly because it's Japan. But the good news is that you actually have time to do things in one of these earthquakes once it starts. And leaving the building is maybe one of the options, which is what we did. Okay, if you could click the lower link, this is my very last thing. And so what do you do at a meeting? Somewhere toward the end, you gather everybody and take a photo. Well, this is 40 earthquake geologists during the main shock of the Tohoku earthquake taking our group photo. And all generally having a good time. But at the same time, this earthquake, when this image was taken, was into its 4th or 5th minute. And at that point, we knew that we were seeing a paradigm change in progress, because Northeast Japan only was expecting an 8.4 maximum. And 8.4 earthquakes don't last 5 minutes. Only 9s last that long. So as we were having fun taking this picture, we knew that in 20 to 30 minutes, a tsunami was going to arrive somewhere on the coast, and somebody was going to get hammered. And so it went quickly from amusing to pretty sobering. And we went next door to the cafeteria, where they had NHK live video of the tsunami coming in and sweeping into Sendai Bay, and all the videos that you've seen. So anyway, if you can't read that, resiliency lesson number 1 from these things is subduction zone earthquakes don't necessarily shake that hard. You can't relate them to California-type crustal earthquakes that you may have felt, but they last a really, really long time. So they do all their damage by fairly gentle shaking, but really persistent over 4 or 5 minutes. And so that's the whole story. So I wanted to end on sort of a good note. And so the fact that the shaking is of a different style than you might be expecting, and that you may have been through a 6 or a 7 somewhere in the world, and a 9 seems unimaginably huge, it's actually just the opposite. You know, the actual event is not that, is very survivable, and it's a matter of hardening infrastructure and things like that, or having a warning system, or having a plan for what you're actually going to do during this 5 minutes, depending on where you are. But it's, I wanted to plant the seed in your heads that it's actually a pretty manageable risk and not a catastrophic kind of thing, like an asteroid where we're all going to die, and why worry about it? So anyway, I don't know if we're going to do questions now or we're going to do Rob. Okay. All right. Thank you.
We'll have Rob Johnson will speak now, and after he's finished, we'll have opportunity for questions.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been a financial advisor for 38 years. I deal every day with, giving people advice on risk management, many times and mostly on their investments, but there are other things that come up. And I've been involved in disasters for a long time. Hands-on, I've been a reservist with FEMA. In fact, today's my last day. I have a 4-year-old grandson that lives with me, and I can't deploy anymore to disasters because I've got to deal with him right at home. But I've been around the country, and I love him, so it's okay. It's ironic I'm here today to celebrate. This is today my 40th anniversary of being shipwrecked in a typhoon out in the Western Pacific when I was in the Peace Corps. So it's nice to celebrate that with friends. So I go back, and I've had a lot of my hands-on disaster involved flooding in 1990. Happened to be the worst floods in 50 years, 5 days after I got elected to the state legislature in the 40th district. So I was involved in that. In 1996, I started being a reservist with FEMA on disaster recovery, and I've been on around 25 disasters or so. I've watched houses slide off cliffs in Laguna Niguel. I've been through hurricanes in Florida, that came while I was there. And I was in I was down in New Orleans 10 years ago with Hurricane Katrina and saw that debacle as far as a classic example of how not to respond to a major disaster. Because we know that the exact future occurrence is unknowable of this, but coming, we know that, is we've got a interval timeline of potentially over many years, possibly. And what he started to say at the end, I just want to reiterate as a layperson, because I spent almost 3 years as executive director of Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group from, when was that? It was 89 to 2001. And you have to say that, if the expectation of earthquake damage is too apocalyptic, then nobody will do anything. It really is the notion of is an asteroid coming tomorrow? Well, gee, should I get an emergency kit ready? It's no. And, things like that. So you have to have some understanding that, yes, this is survivable and it's doable. And yes, if the ground is shaking for 4 minutes, yes, it probably is a Cascadia subduction zone. Infrastructure resilience, he mentioned this too, it really is the key. Infrastructure resilience is the key to overall recovery. Internet, phone lines, electric power, natural gas lines, water, highways, sewage treatment, hospitals, jails, fuel supplies, shipping capability, public schools, universities, streets and roads. All of those things are necessary for us to recover from an unknown level of damage from a potential earthquake. All of them can be strengthened over time. And the thing I want to give as a major takeaway on this is something that when I learned as Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group Director is that always support public efforts at strengthening infrastructure. It's a huge surprise that how little expense is involved with making a new building or structure dramatically more resistant to earthquake damage if it's planned on the front end. It's not 40 or 50% more, it's 2 to 4% more. In some cases, it's hardly any extra cost at all. If you plan an overpass, if you plan a building, if you plan a school, a hospital, any of this, to be stronger and more resilient to earthquake damage on the front end. On the other hand, when we talk about unreinforced masonry buildings, things like that, those are enormously expensive to try to retrofit. And with limited resources out in the public, because we're all, trying to get by with a million other priorities, to put millions into really old buildings to try to make them resilient, and you still probably won't get the result that you want. And the building, may just be at the end of its life, that you can't be real romantic about the notion of preserving all old buildings in a society. You've got to really look and say, look, what is the performance level we need of that structure? And in many cases, you need to replace it. But once again, you replace it intelligently each time, whether it's your personal house or it's a school or whatever, you put more resources into it to make it more resilient. And if we're lucky, because there is some luck involved here, over time you will create a very resilient structure and a very resilient culture that will not be suffering from earthquake damage anywhere near the notion of just blowing it off or ignoring it. I deal a lot and have dealt a lot mostly in the floodplain. Right now I'm hiding in plain sight living in Stanwood on the city council, and I'm chair of the Public Works Committee. And the first thing I did is I tried to kill the efforts at building a new city hall in the floodplain. Why? Because there's a flood risk down there. But then everyone said, well, we should just elevate a new building or elevate our existing building. Well, guess what? As Dr. Goldfinger knows, it's a liquefaction zone out in the floodplain. So if we jack up the city hall 12 feet, we'll eliminate the flood hazard, and the next small earthquake will probably just wipe it out because it's on a liquefaction zone. So these are the things that the public sphere has to discuss. I'm very distressed to hear about Oregon State campus out on the coast built in the floodplain in the tsunami zone on a liquefaction area that, it's hard to justify in my head how they would say that that was our only option, but that's how that goes. I'm not going to stand here and read a earthquake preparation manual because you can Google that online anytime and do your own earthquake preparation kit. I will ask just for a point here is that how many of you drove here today? Okay. How many of you could walk home right now in the shoes that you're wearing? That's good. That's good. There's obviously retirees in the room. But seriously, folks, no, I mean, it's things like that. I mean, I'm a person that wherever I'm at, my car is at, and I'm going around in my car. I always keep an old pair of tennis shoes and socks in the trunk of my car because I'm not going to walk home 30, 40 miles in dress shoes. But it's that type of thing where you have to know how you can deal with things, and you start with the basics. The key to recovery on all of these things about infrastructure still comes down to people. So, buy earthquake insurance, get an earthquake prep kit, do all of those things, keep it in your car as well as your home, and, get to know your neighbors. Because ultimately, we all have to work together on this, and your neighbors who you might not even know, and I'm guilty of that myself in Stanwood, but your neighbors might end up being the best people you ever knew for recovering from a disaster. So thank you very much. Okay.
Jane and Don will have the microphones. I'm going to skip the questions that the program committee folks put together in case some of you, or defer to some of you, are badge-wearing members who now's the time to ask a question by raising your hand. So maybe I'll start off with one. So my quick question is, how confident are you in your predictions?
In predictions, no confidence at all. We don't. We can't predict earthquakes at all. That's the thing, is we can forecast probabilities based on the past. That's all we can do. It'd be like forecasting the weather based on, What's the weather usually like in November? Well, we saw last night what it's usually like in November. So we can do that, but that's all we can do right now. There's no ability to predict anything. But as far as the past history, that's been replicated a number of times by a number of different people. So that's, I would say, very confident. But what?
Okay, question, Don?
Yes,
Is this
sir.
on? Yeah. Can you refresh us on the value of the numbers, 9.2, 9.3, what those percentages mean, what those numbers mean, and what the tenth means, et cetera?
Well, yeah. So those are magnitudes. They're called moment magnitudes. They're the energy level of the earthquake, and they're it's a log scale though, and the difference between 9 and 9.1, it sounds like, oh, that's a small thing. That's actually 3.2 times more energy in a 9.1 than in a 9. So it goes up a lot for each tenth. So when I talk about broad things like 9-ish, 8.8 to 9.2, that's a huge range of energy, going from really big to really, really, really big. But the energy level shouldn't scare you in and of itself, because that energy is spread out over 1,000 kilometers, 700 miles, going from middle of Vancouver Island to Northern California. So the energy that's expended on the Oregon and southward part of that subduction zone, you wouldn't feel that here. You don't feel all of that energy all at once. So don't let the number's impressive, but it's not the whole story. But the larger the number, the larger the tsunami will get. That's for sure. But then on the other hand, you're well inland, so your tsunami here, the models that I've seen, and there isn't really a comprehensive scenario set of models, but the tsunami should be roughly around 2 meters is the current. So I'll just elaborate just a little bit. I mean, there's no. Vasily Titov at NOAA in Seattle is the guy who models this, and I'm just generalizing quite a lot. So I saw his models for a specific point on Whidbey Island, and it was about 2 meters. And that site was on the west side facing out the strait, so they should have had a bigger tsunami than you would have here. But this is a very general number, and don't take it too seriously. The other thing that happens during these earthquakes is the Puget Sound may well start to slosh. There's a Japanese word for it called seiche. And it's not the tsunami. It's actually like as if you took a bathtub and just gave it a jerk, and it would just slosh back and forth like that for a while. And that could actually be bigger than the tsunami. So there'll be those two things going on at the same time.
So I was in a Nisqually earthquake in Seattle in the art museum. Was that a subduction? Because the earth was rolling, but I didn't think it was a subduction.
No, that was what we call a slab earthquake. So it was actually down in the subducting plate. It wasn't an earthquake between the two plates. It was a tensional earthquake in the lower plate. So at Nisqually, it was 50 kilometers, roughly 25 miles down. So you're pretty distant from it. But that's a good example of how the distance basically filters out the very high frequency, and you get the rolling from that. And that's why it felt that way.
Please.
I'm happy for my friends here in Bellingham. I live in Birch Bay. Would you like to tell me at my 8.5 feet above sea level what my future scenario looks like?
8.5 feet. That's about like that. Chances are you'll probably be okay. But you're kind of right at where I would guess the bathtub ring would be from the sloshing and the tsunami together. But it would have to be one of the largest of the large earthquakes. So all of those, even those 9-ish earthquakes, the 19 of them, they're all different sizes among them too. And so you would have to be at sort of the large end of the larger class to really worry about it. But there's other things that may happen if you're on the water. You may have, like Rob mentioned, liquefaction and other things that could affect your site. So it's a good. If you know a geologist, you might want to have him take a look at your site. Just
Dr. Goldfinger.
Yes, sir.
I was very impressed by your presentation. We are now all clued in. We're going to make a plan. How is this information not getting to people who plan universities?
Well, it's getting to some of them, just not ours. My major professor is a guy named Bob Yates, a really famous geology professor, and we sat down with Ed Ray, the president of OSU, and we laid out the whole thing. It's not that they're not getting it, and we told him basically, we put it in terms of the Challenger disaster. I said, you know those two engineers that told the NASA guys not to launch the Challenger the next day? I looked at him and I said, we're those guys. And they have other options. They have other good options, and they are not using them for reasons I don't get.
Where should we go in the city and county to learn how to be better prepared in the eventuality we do have an earthquake?
You know, I'm going to defer to...
They were invited here and they couldn't attend, but when I was asked to come up here, I didn't want to be here in place of local emergency managers because they play an incredibly important role. But Bellingham Emergency Management, Whatcom County Emergency Management, all you have to do on the internet is just Google Emergency Management Whatcom County or Emergency Management Bellingham, and you'll come up with plenty of local website with plenty of checklists on disaster preparation in general, earthquake in particular. And it's not hard to find those resources at all. Red Cross has major earthquake prep websites, as well as they even, as a fundraiser, sell earthquake preparation kits already made for you. So.
Okay, please, Don.
Hi. I want to clarify with Dr. Goldfinger one thing that you said. When you talked about the power of the earthquake along the entire fault zone in, say, a 9.0 earthquake, is that entire 9.0 felt all consistently all along the fault? Or did you say that it was distributed and so we would feel something less?
Well, it is distributed. It's a measure of the total energy released in the earthquake. The part that you feel is mostly going to be the part that's straight west of here. You're not going to feel the part that's in California so much. But anyway, yeah, you don't feel the whole thing. It's also distributed in patches. It's not the nice smooth red blobs that were in the movie. That's the best we can estimate right now. So where the cutting edge science is now is to try to go back and look at past earthquakes and see if it shakes harder, typically in some places than others in a mappable way. And then we can use that to refine the hazards. And it turns out that it does, at least in the last few, and we don't know how repeatable that is yet, so it's not really usable information. And I'm not sure I'd want to bet the farm on it anyway. But it's very heterogeneous. It's very mixed up, patchy pattern typically.
You mentioned that at 8.4, they were only planning for an 8.4, and that they could not, even if they planned for a 9, it wouldn't have made any difference?
Well, no, it would have made a difference in some ways. So with respect to the earthquake, Japan was so well prepared that it actually didn't matter if they had an 8 or a 9. The earthquake damage was really sparse. You could walk around Sendai, and as long as you were above the watermark of the tsunami, you'd be hard-pressed to find any damage at all. And I was there with a film crew, and they were kind of annoyed because they were running around with these big cameras, and they were focusing these big lenses on the little crack in the wall. That's all they could find. And so, but on the other side of the tsunami zone, it was a completely different story. And so the Fukushima power plant, they were well prepared for a tsunami at those power plants as well, except for one thing. So they'd planned on a 2 to 3 meter tsunami, and inexplicably they'd put the power generators for when the system is shut down in the basement. And that didn't work. If they'd put the generators on the roof, and the generators generate power to run the pumps to cool the fueling rods, if they'd put those on the roof, they would have been fine, because the power plant survived the earthquake very well. So sometimes it's on little decisions like that the whole thing plays out.
Our last question is coming up right here.
Given the kind of fill that Bellingham Bay structures are put on, specifically the old GP site, is there a way that earthquake-proof buildings could be built in that kind of location?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but engineers would say we can mitigate anything, and they can almost. You know, it just takes. It might take cubic dollars to do it, but they can pretty much mitigate almost anything. So if you drive piles down far enough, you're going to find something that's not liquefiable to support a structure. And it's going to be relatively expensive to do that. So it becomes a cost decision more than a can you do it decision. In Sendai, I saw a great example of that where the year before the earthquake, they realized that the Sendai airport runway ran across, they'd actually filled over a creek. And so there was liquefiable sand in this little sliver that ran across the creek. And they realized that if during an earthquake, that part of the runway would probably fail. And so they went out and they used grout. They drilled a bunch of 4-inch holes down into this, filled it full of grout, and hardened the runway that way, just in a little strip where this creek was. And we went out and saw it, walked out on the runway and saw it last year. And it survived, and they did this in 2010. In 2011, they have a magnitude 9 earthquake. And after they cleared all the debris off the runway, they were using it, you know, within a couple of days. So it paid off.
Sure.
And I want to add something to that too, that in our consultations with British Columbia and other areas, the airport in Vancouver is all built on fill and is a complete liquefaction zone, and in a Cascadia subduction zone event, the Vancouver earthquake might become unusable. But they also have an older airport up around Abbotsford. I think it was built as a military base along many years ago. That's, you know, has a completely different geologic base to it that should be able to remain functional. So at least for emergency flights and things like that, that might have to get, you know, shifted over to a place like Abbotsford. But this is part of resiliency. You never want to just have one thing that you depend on. You have to try to have other options as well.
And the option right now is for us to thank our two guests. And, very nice job. Thanks for coming. Yeah, you're welcome. Good job.